Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So it has been a while and I took a little unintentional break for the month of November, which I spent kind of focusing more on my blog content, which you will have noticed if you follow me over there. But I am so happy to be back today filming a video for my YouTube channel. I've really missed it. And I wanted to go ahead and start with a video that a few of you had requested that covers one of my favorite topics, and that is vintage clothing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I shop for vintage clothing and then how I incorporate it into my life while I'm wearing a capsule wardrobe. So if you're interested in that, please keep watching. So for me, there are four main places that I look for vintage clothing, and these are Etsy, eBay, thrift stores, and vintage stores. And I'm going to go over each of these in a little more detail and talk about what I like and what I don't like about each one. So let's start off with the thrift store. I love thrifting, but thrifting for vintage can be a challenge. So know going into thrifting for vintage that if you want to look for vintage things in the thrift store, you're going to have to really look, and you're going to have to go a lot, and you're going to need to know how to tell if something is vintage, which I'll cover at the end of this video. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned to the end for that. But I do love the thrill of finding a great vintage piece for such a good deal at a thrift store, so that's awesome. However, because it is such a challenge to actually find vintage these days, it's a bit of a slow process, so it's not my favorite method for that reason, but I found some really great pieces over the years. I used to actually have a vintage shop, so most of those have gone to new homes since then, but one of my favorite finds was a 1940s beaded cardigan, which I'll put a picture in because I think I still have some old pictures of it, that I found at a Goodwill for about $4, and it was beautiful and flawless, beautiful condition, no holes or anything, and that was just so exciting to find something like that. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on finding vintage at the thrift store. So next, let's talk about vintage shops. Vintage shops are a little different from thrift stores because thrift stores just have anything and everything that anybody has donated to that particular charity, whereas a vintage shop is stocked of exclusively vintage pieces, and the owner likely has a knowledge of vintage and of the value of vintage, so the prices will reflect this and they'll be higher. So at a thrift shop, things are going to be cheap, and you'll probably be able to find some pretty good deals if you do find vintage. And at a vintage shop, it's easy to find the vintage, but the prices will be higher. So I have found a few things at vintage shops over the years. My recommendation is to look out for seasonal sales because a vintage shop will likely follow traditional seasonal sale models. So things like Black Friday or holiday sales, you can often find at a vintage store, and I typically prefer vintage stores. I typically prefer vintage shops for special occasion pieces that I don't mind spending a little bit more money on. However, the piece that I have to show you here today is more of an everyday style dress that I found at a vintage vendor, and it is a little baby pink 1940s day dress, which I haven't really worn a lot. This was one that I had in my vintage shop, but I am keeping it in my summer clothes because I want to try and find a way to style it next year. It is so cute. It has this really cool V-style inset here on the bodice, and then little covered buttons that are so cute, and then it just goes into kind of an A-line gathered skirt. I really love the back because it has beautiful darts that make it fit really nicely. But this was a great find on a sale rack at a vintage place, and I love the style and the color and the fit. So that is one of my vintage shop finds from a couple of years ago. Okay, so let's talk eBay. eBay may not be the most glamorous place to shop, but when it comes to vintage, it is pretty great. So my favorite way to shop for vintage on eBay is to search by era. So I'll search 1940s dress or 1910s shirt or whatever I'm looking for, and then I like to sort it by price, low to high, and you can sometimes find some really cool things that people just didn't know what they were, or lots of different styles of dresses. So I think eBay is the easiest way to find really cool vintage for a really good price. So I love it for that reason. The con to that is that you don't always know what you're getting. A lot of times the photography is really dark and hard to see, but that can lead to some really cool finds. So if you're willing to take a risk, I highly recommend shopping for vintage on eBay. Some of my favorite pieces have come off of eBay. I have two of those favorite pieces to show you today. One is my kind of special occasion evening gown of choice, the only one in my wardrobe, and it is this 1940s black lace and nude mesh evening gown. It is so beautiful. This was an amazing find. I believe it was about $15, and it just had really dark photos, but I felt like the gown really had potential, and I couldn't really tell what I was looking at, but I decided to take a chance on it, and it turned out to fit me perfectly, and it was in perfect flawless condition, which was just kind of amazing for a piece like this. So it is sheer on the top. I wear kind of a neutral undershirt with it to keep it from being 100% sheer. That would be awkward. And then it has this beautiful lace peplum detail that kind of extends at the sides of the skirt, and then it goes all the way down to the floor. There's tons of kind of sheer material and a lining. It has a side zipper and then kind of a hook and eye detail on this vent in the back. So this is such a cool piece. I think it's awesome because I think a 1940s evening dress really translates to today. It looks so modern and sophisticated, just with the right hair and makeup and accessories. It looks like something a designer would have created today, but you have the awesome knowledge that it is super old and vintage and more sustainable, which I love. So this is one of my all-time favorite vintage finds, which was from eBay. And then another favorite piece from eBay, you will have seen if you read my recent post on my holiday capsule wardrobe. So I put together a little addition to my capsule wardrobe of the holiday specific pieces. So I swapped some things out for my favorite holiday pieces because I am just super cheesy when it comes to holiday dressing. I want everything red and sparkly and just fun like that. I can't be a minimalist when it comes to Christmas time. So one of my pieces is this 1960s red velvet, super cheesy, awesome dress that I just adore. This was in a lot on eBay, which I bought back when I was doing my vintage shop, and I separated this one out and kept it for myself because I love it. It has this really cool high neckline in the front and then kind of scoops down in the back. You've got this awesome back panel of red satin with a huge bow. And then it comes to about knee length, a little bit above probably. It's 1960s, just very classic 60s style. I love that the sleeves have these fun frills with lace, which actually I think feels very trendy right now. And then the front has these two little satin bows. So my theory, because it looks like it was handmade, is that the person who made this just couldn't decide where to stop with the trimmings, so they just went all out. But I think it's the perfect Christmas party dress with some little like sheer polka dotted black tights and black heels. I think it's just super fun and cute. So this is definitely not the kind of thing I would wear every day, but when it comes to your Christmas party, this is what I'll be pulling out this year. So this is one of my other favorite eBay finds. And then lastly, let's talk about Etsy. So Etsy is one of my favorite ways to shop for vintage also. Etsy and eBay are probably tied for favorites, which is kind of funny that they're online. But Etsy is great because there's such a plethora of different shops, so many different sellers with really good eyes. I love that things are curated a lot of times on Etsy, and then also it is really easy to find something in any different price point on Etsy, I've found. So you can find dresses that range from, you know, $20 to $50 and then $50 to $100, and then you can go all out if you want to. There's kind of everything on Etsy available, so I really like that. I don't know that I would say there was any downside to vintage shopping on Etsy other than that you can't see what you're buying in person, but I think that Etsy does a lot better. Etsy sellers do a lot better of a job with doing realistic photos compared to eBay. It's just easier to see what you are looking at. So I found that things I've ordered off of Etsy have been more true to the photos than things off of eBay, but the plus side of that with eBay is that they're often better than they were in the photos. So yeah, I love Etsy for when I'm looking for something really specific because the search engine is just really good and easy to use. So I really like to use Etsy for something that I already know exists, if that makes sense. So a specific designer or brand, a piece that I am aware of. So an example of this would be one of my favorite things in my closet, which is my vintage Coach Regina. And this is from the 1980s. I got this from Dear Golden Vintage. If you have not checked out Dear Golden Vintage, be prepared to browse if you love vintage because They have the most beautiful, beautiful shop. So I ordered this over the summer, I believe, and it has already become one of my favorite things in my closet. It is such a nice soft leather bag and so classic, and I get compliments on it all the time and people asking where can I get that, and so I just tell them look up Vintage Coach on Etsy. So I think Etsy is really great for when you want to look up something specific like that because it's easy to find and easy to narrow down. So yeah, Etsy is another one of my favorite ways to find vintage. So now that I've talked about my favorite ways to find vintage and showing you a few of my favorite pieces, I'm going to quickly talk about how to recognize vintage garments when you see them. So one of the things that's been the most helpful for me is to look at the labels. So actually labels in garments weren't sewn in by machine until kind of the later half of the 20th century. So if you look at the label, if it has little tiny machine stitches, you'll know that it's a little more recent. But if it has little hand stitches in each corner, that kind of tells you that it's older. So that's something to look out for. If you're searching through a thrift store, you might notice a hand sewn label and think, oh, that might be vintage. A really awesome resource if you're wanting to kind of place a vintage piece is on the Vintage Fashion Guild website. They have something called their label resource where you can look up a different designer or brand and they will pop up pictures of the labels throughout the years that the brand has existed. So that was one way when I found my 1940s cardigan that I talked about at Goodwill. I was able to put the brand into the vintage label resource and see which one matched the one on my garment and find the era that existed. So that's a really awesome resource if you are looking to place the era of your vintage. Another way to determine if something is vintage is to look at the zippers. Plastic zippers weren't used until the 60s and the 70s. So if there is a metal zipper, normally a vintage metal zipper is kind of a thicker zipper. If there's one of those in your garment, then you know that it is probably pre-1960s. So that's a really great thing to look for as well. I'll put a link to the Vintage Fashion Guild website down below because they have a lot of information on dating the era of your vintage. So if you are interested in more information on that, that is really helpful. So I highly recommend checking that out. And then really quickly before I go, I just wanted to talk a little bit about vintage with a capsule wardrobe and how I kind of incorporate vintage shopping into that. So you may have noticed most of the pieces I showed are kind of special occasion wear. So my evening dress, that just kind of stays in a separate closet for if I need it. I've only actually had the occasion to wear it once or twice, so that's just a piece that I'll keep around for when those occasions come up. So it doesn't really stay in my capsule wardrobe that I wear day to day. My super cheesy Christmas dress is in my Christmas capsule wardrobe that I have right now, so that doesn't go really year-round either. So most of these pieces kind of stay packed away as special occasion wear. However, I really do love shopping vintage for accessories, like my vintage coach. That's something that I use every single day. And then also I am wanting to try and incorporate 1940s and 1950s simple dresses into my daytime wardrobe come spring and summer. So watch out for that because that's something I'll be playing around with. So like that pink dress that I showed earlier, I'm going to be trying to style that this spring and summer in a little bit more of a modern way. That's something that I kind of struggle with from time to time, and I think we all do if we wear vintage and like to look modern. It's kind of interesting trying to balance the two. So anyway, those are kind of my brief thoughts on vintage with a capsule wardrobe. I will sometimes have pieces that are in the capsule wardrobe, like if I have a vintage cardigan or top or something. But the dresses, which are kind of my favorite thing, don't really end up in my capsule wardrobe often. But I'm going to try and incorporate one in spring, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, guys, that is kind of my video on vintage that I've been planning to do for a while. I really hope this was helpful for you if you're interested in getting into shopping for vintage or you just have an interest in it. And I hope you enjoyed seeing the little clips of my vintage dresses. I just love all of those. But I'd love to hear if you shop for vintage, where you like to shop for vintage, or what your best find has been. It's just so fun to hear all about different vintage items. But I really appreciate you guys watching today. If you are new to my channel, I would love to have you subscribe. That just allows you to be notified whenever I post a new video, so you can kind of keep up with what's going on here on my channel. And if you are interested to see more from me, please check out my blog at www.chic-ethique.com. I post quite a bit over there, and you can also check me out on Instagram at Chic Éthique. And I would love to have you join me on either of those platforms. But again, I really appreciate you watching it today. That is it for me, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.